in the Dutch debate, so in the public sphere. And so I've done several things. I've written books for a larger audience. You can't read them because they're in Dutch, but they are real books, believe me. I did stuff on the radio, on television. I wrote op-eds. I'm active on Twitter. I give policy advice. I was even asked by the Scientific Council of Government Research to write a policy brief on the future of migration. So I do not complain about, let's say, the need and about not being heard. I'm being heard, and we have our means as experts to be heard. I think that's, at least in my opinion, is not the problem. The problem is much more that we not only want to be heard, but we want to have an impact on the framing. And I think that's also what Stephen was talking about. And the framing is still very alarmistic and very presentist. I'm a historian. I'll come back to that. So, of course, for the French, the Renaud Camus, Le Grand Remplacement, which also made quite an impact in other countries, also in Germany, in the Netherlands. So this idea of Umvolkung, etc., is really has gained importance. Collier's book on Exodus, so that this is kind of this idea that Africa would just empty out, etc. But also these kind of infographics, which on the one hand think, oh, that's nice, I like infographics, they give you in one, but if you just move the arrows a bit to the left, I mean, Europe is gone. And it also, of course, is this idea that migrants only go from A to B, and that's so also reducing to a kind of simplicity that Stephen was talking about. So I think, so there's two things that we as experts have to deal with. One is fear, obviously. Migration as a threat, both to the security of societies, both to our culture of society. No more mosques. And interestingly here, migrants are very much seen as people with agency, but with the wrong agency. The wrong because they move to our place and then they don't integrate, they are culturally alien, they will replace us, all these kinds of fears. But very interesting that here the migrant is invested with a lot of agency only. These are the bad hombres, as some presidents have said. And then the other thing is the empathy frame. So this was the fear. The empathy frame, here you see that migrants are devoid of agency. And it's much more then seen in migration as a kind of a physical phenomenon. So migrants are kind of particles that are being attracted or pushed or pulled by big anonymous forces. Either it's poverty, it's population pressure, think of Africa, or it's climate change. And of course, they all want to come to us, to the rich world. And whereas, let's say, in the fear frame, the proposed solution is, well, close the borders and build walls, and that's also what the EU is doing now, and also with externalizing the borders now to south of the Sahara. Of course, the solution, when you take this more empathy frame, that you say, okay, of course it's awful that these people drown, but well, hey, we can't take care of the whole world. And then it's fighting the drivers of migration, which more or less implies that migration is a problem and is not good. So you really have to target the drivers themselves. And I think these kinds of framing is much harder. It's hard to be heard, but to convince the public that these are not the best frames to understand what we are talking about. So the role of science, I would say, is to change this framing, but this is very much an uphill battle. Because migration, but also integration, or whatever term you would like to use, is defined in a very myopic way. It's narrowed down to, well, basically people we would not like to have in our midst. Yeah? So only specific types of migrants and migrations are being looked at. And also only looking at the alleged negative effects. What we have to do, but that's not easy, is to broaden the phenomenon, saying that migration is a systemic aspect of human societies and always has been, which also means that we also have to look at internal migrations. For example, in China, I mean, the floating population is more than 250 million, people moving from the countryside to cities with very similar mechanisms than we see in our world. We also have to look at high-skilled migrants. We have to look at positive effects. So to take a much broader view than this very myopic way that the media and also politicians are pushing upon us. But there's a big problem, and this already has been said by the others. The debate is indeed highly polarized. I don't have to explain that here, which also makes that many scholars choose not to interfere. I mean, I'm on Twitter, and you get a load of shit even if you tweet, let's say, the most inoffensive statistics, for example, you're being attacked by trolls, etc. I mean, it's fine with me, but you have to like it. But then secondly, I think reframing is also seen as denying the problem. That also has been mentioned by my colleagues, to belittle the problem. So what the Germans have this nice word, Verharmlosung, so that you don't take the problem really serious, and then you're out of the debate, because you're not a serious scholar. You're just a leftish open border activist. I mean, that kind of accusations then follow. And thirdly, that even when people accept scholarly knowledge, there is a very presentist thing. So that migration is a modern phenomenon. And that also, let's say, comparisons with previous migrations are no use. And as a historian, of course, this is very problematic for me. Also because I really think that comparisons through time really teach us something about the present and also of the future. So I think what we have to do, and again, this is not an easy task and this will take a lot of time, and we have to think about how to do this in the best way, is to move beyond fear and empathy, at least the two frames that I set out, and really to problematize and change the prevailing migration pessimist framework, which, by the way, means that we also have to, it always works well if you take these worries, people come with worries and all these migrants. Yes, of course you have to take these worries seriously. That's also what the populists say. But taking worries seriously does not mean that you have to fall in this populist trap, but which also means that you have to explain why it might not be such a problem as people think. Yeah? So you really have to offer a different framework, and also to show different mechanisms, show that this idea of population pressure and etc., that it doesn't work as people think, and as Stephen said, that it's much more complex. But saying that something is complex does not mean that you can't explain it. Yeah? I think these are two different things. But still, I do think that facts have to be offered, although I see the downside of it, as Stephen and we also discussed this morning. Because I also I'm just give you one example of this. So I did some work on EU statistics during the so-called refugee crisis, which of course was a political crisis and not a refugee crisis, when many people, also all journalists, this is unprecedented. We never have seen so many migrants before. Well, look at the 1990s. And secondly, people say, okay, there might be more in the 1990s, but then they came from Europe, from Yugoslavia. Yeah, some, but also then, let's say, the major groups were the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. So this can help this does help in the debate, that people say, okay, maybe we don't have to panic that much. I mean, we're still in the same fear and empathy framework, but also within that framework you can do, I think, useful work. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Leo. Thank you Thank you very much to all our speakers for their remarks, their comments, and for being short. You'll have time, of course, to discuss more, but really the idea this afternoon, this session and the next one, is to give you an occasion to debate these issues. So I'm now going to take a round of questions. And please, you can identify yourself, just say your name and where you come from, after all. And you can ask the question in French, we'll translate, but otherwise, English is fine. Alors, question.
Thanks. John Crowley from UNESCO. Hi, nice to see you, Steve. Long time no see. Three comments. I don't disagree with anything anyone said, and it's part of my job to push the same kinds of things within the UN system for my sins. First comment, it was a very European perspective. If you want an international perspective, it has to be about other things too, and I don't just mean about Africa. How does this look from Paraguay or from Malaysia? One of the challenges is that a lot of the debate, including the policy-oriented academic debate, is very much framed by what's specific about the European experience. And that's not going to get traction at the international level, unless, of course, it's directed only at the EU. But that's not going to work, because the EU doesn't control the migration space, because by definition, the migrants are not coming necessarily from the EU. Second point, how much of a parallel is the IPCC? The I in IPCC stands for intergovernmental. And that's not clearly what you're talking about. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't something of relevance to be taken from it, but the IPCC, for better, for worse, it's both one of its strengths and one of its weaknesses, is controlled by governments. The very fact that it's achieved so much being controlled by governments is remarkable. And if you want to know how much it's achieved, just look at how much money has been spent to try to discredit it, which is the best metric of success in this world. But still, it's governmentally controlled. Is that what you'd want? Or is it something else? And if it's something else, then how does it connect organically to the policy process? Or is it just another kind of lobbying organization, lobbying for good causes with good ideas, but still just another speech tank, think tank / speech tank? And finally, again, forgetting the intergovernmental part of the IPCC, is the idea to follow that kind of path. The IPCC doesn't do research, it doesn't produce messages as such, it synthesizes. And the whole point of the IPCC, as you know, is to have this elaborate rolling process of reviewing all the published literature, weighing it, sifting it, and producing a synthesis report that reflects what science really knows. Is that the idea, or is it something else? And again, entirely possible for it to be something else. But since you made in the call for this meeting that parallel, I'd like to hear more about the parallel.
Thank you, John. These are indeed precisely the sort of questions that we have on the table. Our idea was, you can say the I is international or intergovernmental, but our idea is precisely that at the moment, and not just today in Marrakesh, international organizations like the IOM are, they have their own mandate. They want to get, they get funds with a particular agenda. So that's not clearly, the idea is not to, the international would not work so well. There's also a discredit, as you know, in multilateral institutions. So it seemed that going the way of having an endorsement by government, the IPCC, at the end, there are 30 pages negotiated line by the governments, but it's still the scientists who, as you say, do the state of the art. So it's clear what the scientists do and what actually the governments sign at the bottom in the end, and it's transparent as well. So I think that's where the inspiration went. But and the Eurocentric perspective, all of these things are very much on the table. And thank you so much for bringing out the challenges that we are facing this afternoon. Thank you. And, don't be shy.
Thank you very much. Yves Charby, Université Paris-Descartes and CEPED. I was very interested by all of the presentations, and thank you very much. I would like to say, as the objective of articulating social sciences and migratory policies is quite a challenge in this period where social sciences are abandoned for a biological approach of migrations like emptiness versus high pressure and low pressure, in pure demographic terms. So it's really concerning. I fully agree with the fact that I would like to say that François' book clearly shows how difficult it is to counteract the use and misuse of data. It's really a crucial problem, and too often we are not heard. And I would just like to point something which to me seems extremely annoying in view of the rising populism, is that indeed in the past it was far more violent. I mean, what happened in 1893 with the Italians being stoned and murdered in the south of France is extremely serious. But then the question is that now it may not be as serious, but we are stuck, if we want to influence political sciences, with this big problem of fake news and the lack of control of, thank God, it's democracy, but social networks are extremely difficult. It is a serious problem if we want to have some sort of influence, because precisely the rapidity of the fake news and the rest makes very difficult for us to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you. In the back, Camille. Ouais.
So, Jill Alpes, I'm a research affiliate at the Nijmegen Center for Border Research, independent research consultant and former policy officer on return matters at Amnesty International. And my question is about the space where you want to locate yourself, because academics have to do research according to certain internal evaluation criteria, and it's great to see that there is an initiative from within academia to engage with matters that are not actually valorized within academia. So with public debate. So I have two questions. One is, should the target or the objective, the why of it all, should it be with the public debates at large, and then we have to think really about how democracy works at the moment, or should it be the policymakers and the experts, so sort of an expert sort of discussion? And the other question is really just a door I wanted to point at and to see whether you want to push it or open it. But within NGOs that have also reached, such as Oxfam or Amnesty, there are specialized people that only think about how to do advocacy, how to do that bridging. And so what do you want to do with that bridge? Like do you want to feed information into the people whose jobs it is already is to do that bridging, or what kind of bridges could one build between the NGO advocacy world and the academic world?
Thank you, Jill. It's also a question. Antoine, you should have a real seat instead of being dans les escaliers. Antoine Pécou actually wrote a very interesting chapter recently on how actually NGOs were the first ones to count deaths at the border. And way before researchers ever did that, then academics took on that issue, and now the IOM has bought the projects. So it's the question also of bottom-up and participatory research is also an interesting one. Should we take one more?
Well, can we address this? Because I mean, also a great question, and I think it really ties with John's question as well about who's the audience, how does it connect with all sorts of other agencies, and because also, I mean, we've got UN Population Division, IOM, UNHCR. There are a lot of existing big bodies that do research. A lot of us contribute to that from time to time and so forth. And what's our relation to those bodies? What's our relations to NGOs, and how do we want to position ourselves vis-a-vis the broader public? Yeah, these are the big questions that we've already been tangling with this morning. And the easiest answer is, well, yes, we want to do it all, but we're trying to work out a roadmap for best how to do that. So, for instance, vis-a-vis the Global Compact, there was some discussion this morning. Can we position ourselves not as a competing body to that, but as a collaborating international body of scholars, basically? And it has to be an open network to scholars. It can't be a closed shop. A number of people just set themselves up. It has to be an open network. And as John was saying, one of these organizations that, like the IPCC, that, how did you put it, sort of siphons or filters the scientific knowledge and information, and then it becomes a matter of communication. We had a great intervention from a journalist this morning in the group talking about the difference between information, those facts and findings, and communication, the way you try to change the framing and the ways things are talked about in public, or what I was talking about is these kind of underlying logics or structures of thinking about migration. So, you know, that sounds rather flippant, over-ambitious. We want to kind of try to do it all. It's great to be aspirational, but we also need to have, I think I talked about, you know, it should be 4 parts aspiration at this point, 1 point practicality, and gradually move up the list of practicality.
Yeah, could I also, I'm very glad that the global dimension was brought up, because I think that's exactly what we need. And it's very perceptive that we should not, let's say, make this into a European-centered project. And we talked about that at length also this morning, but it's very good that you brought it up, because if you really want to change how people think about migration, but also to understand for ourselves what the effect of migration is on human societies, well, you can only do this in a global, but also in a historical, long-term perspective. And that will allow us also to get away from the problem. Right? I mean, and that's also, I think, the difference with the climate change, which is obviously is a problem that has to be tackled and solutions have to be found, whereas for migration, of course, you can look at negative effects, but also a lot of positive effects. I mean, so it's much less of a clear problem. So in that sense, there's a difference. And I do think that, let's say, taking a global perspective really gives you a much broader, exactly what I was arguing for, to look at in a much broader way at what migration is and what it does. For example, if you look at China's tremendous economic growth, whatever you think of it, whether you think it's good or bad, but it's there. And of course, this was only possible through massive migration from the countryside to cities. Again, how you evaluate that, that's the second thing. But if you really want to understand what migration does to countries, to people, or take the Philippines, for whom immigration is an export product. I mean, Filipino migrants working in large parts of Southeast Asia and bringing in money also for the Filipino state. I think these much broader aspects of what migration is and what it does is really needed if you really want to move beyond the frames that we are now prisoner of. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll go back to the floor. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Yeah. Thea Hilhurst from Institute of Social Studies, The Hague. I just wanted to remind us that we don't other migrants to an extent that we talk about how migration affects society, how people look at migrants, and forget to also look at how migrants look at migration and how migrants experience migration.
Thank you. Tommaso Vitale from Sciences Po.
Thank you very much. It was just to say thank you for the organization, and because it seems to me extremely important. I will add only 2 topics. The first one is the fact that I consider that the opportunity to open an international panel is extremely important, because it means to have an institutional arena to, in a way, really to focus attention of policymakers. Without it, it will be very difficult. But to focus attention of what? Not really into results and topics, but on the same opportunity to have a dialogue. It seems to me that what is at stake is not attention on specific policy proposals or on specific issue. It's really to focus in a very institutional way the relevance of an arena for a dialogue, because what is missing is not the fact that sometime you have a spiky issue that became relevant in the discussion
but it's the fact that there is not a place where policymakers may have a dialogue with scholars. Second point, it seems to me that it has already been said. It seems to me the most important things, it's a common effort to filter, which means select, 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 because we do, we organize many arenas to reflect and to share knowledge. But in these arenas, there are never less than 300, 400 papers and thousands of complexities. And this issue network is impossible to manage. So it means that it has to be filtering, selection. It gives a lot of power to those who are in charge of selecting, but there is no way out. Yes, it's politics of science. It has a power dimension. It requires to filter and select, and so to assume a responsibility. And to be able to do this, that for me is the specific requirement, because without this filtering, it will be too redundant for a dialogue with policymakers. And for this filtering, we need to think about the legitimacy of those who will filter. And I don't know how to create, but I know that in our science, for this kind of international panels of consulting, the issue of legitimacy towards the board has been addressed. And I'm sure we will be able to find legitimacy mechanism to assure that pluralism, but also parsimony, will be the main golden rules to create conditions for an arena of dialogue. Because just having an arena of proposal is useless. We have seen already documents with 100 proposals around. They cannot be read. What is important is to have the arena of a dialogue where policymakers may come.
Thank you very much, Tommaso.
Could I just reaction to Yves Charby's issue of fake news? Yes, of course, I think, very briefly, that is a problem, although I'm not so sure how big of a problem it is, because it's also because social media is still so young, right? So and we also know that a lot of people are also looking for, let's say, for hoaxes and to make clear what fake news is, and then to show the other side. I would say what I see as a bigger problem is fake mechanisms, and that's also what you talked about yourself, when it comes to very popular myths about what migration is and how it's driven. And I think that I see that as a much greater problem, because that has nothing to do, because people really think that. I mean, so it's not an issue of fake or not fake. And we as scholars can say, well, it's much more complicated. It doesn't work like that. But I'm not sure whether I answer your question.
Just briefly, what I mean is that for populist movements, fake news is a gift. And a means of implementing ideas which are very often xenophobic and racist. That's what I mean. So if we want to address the problem, how do we cope with populism? If we think that populism is not a good thing, being against democracy, we have to be very serious about the propagation of rumors, of wrong interpretations, what François does very well in his book.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I wanted to come back specifically to this question of what's the unique selling point of us as academics. So I think on the one hand there's an opportunity but also a limitation. The opportunity is that, look, we're about producing valid, robust knowledge. That's what we're in it for. And one doesn't have to be a systems theorist to say, you know, we're driven by a different kind of logic to, let's say, think tanks who have a particular ideological agenda, international organizations who have another set of goals and a different agenda. And I think that can bring some credibility. And when we in particular focus on what we've been discussing this morning as these sort of widespread misperceptions or myths on the part of policymakers often about the impact of certain interventions or policies on flows. And often we know that they're based on, misperceptions about the dynamics of migration, and we can list a number of examples where particular interventions will be counterproductive to their goals. Now, I think that's where we're most potent, where we can say, look, well, we know that this causes this sort of consternation, almost outrage, the angry nerds. We say, no, that's just not correct. We know, we have the evidence, and we don't have a particular agenda linked to an ideological position. So I think that is very difficult to maintain, so we have to work very hard to, in a sense, craft our neutrality, and I think that involves a lot of work in terms of which audiences we reach out to, which political parties we try to engage with, and so we have to be absolutely meticulous and impeccable, I think, in maintaining that position of, I say, quote, neutrality, but it's in a sense, it's a craft. But the limitation, I think, is that we've been talking about the non-rational or non-logical bases of a lot of people's views or beliefs about immigration. And there, I mean, I'm quite skeptical about the possibility of changing people's views on immigration through telling them stuff. I remember being at an event in Edinburgh where somebody was saying, but immigration, it's a cost. And I said, well, you know, there's this research by UCL and it shows that the impact of, and this guy said to me, but that's just facts. and I mean, it was, how do you counter that? So people don't really want facts, and I think this is what we've learned in the UK in the context of the Brexit vote. People voted for Brexit not because they think it's going to be economically beneficial to the UK. They know that the research is suggesting it's not. They just don't, it's an emotional reaction, and I think with immigration it is offered as well. So that then comes to this point about what's the potential for us as researchers. I think it's limited, and I think here I would possibly invoke the idea of public philosophy. So I think there's some potential when we talk about reframing things. I don't think we're necessarily going to achieve that through just facts and evidence. We're going to achieve that by mobilizing shared public conceptions of collective memories and collective values, and in a sense aspects, selectively mobilize aspects of our collective memory, our collective history, and our shared sense of values, which make us proud to act in a responsible way towards immigrants. So in a sense, you have to mobilize people in quite an emotional way rather than just through facts.
Here. Thank you, Christina. Questions? I can't see her.
Virginie?
Wait,
just very briefly on this issue of what is fake, what is true, the status of truth in this debate. It is true, I think, that fake data are relatively rare and easy to counter, even though you might get an answer like this is just fact, but this is... fake mechanisms are more pervasive and difficult to dismantle, and here certainly research can have a role, but I think there is a very important role of fake, a micro role of fake events in shaping everyday opinion, a crime that is immediately attributed by the social media to a certain minority, for instance, or and then it turns out to be maybe true or maybe wrong. If it turns out to be wrong, the truth is lost, whereas the fake had hit, and so finding an antidote to this micro role of chronicle of fake events is certainly, I would say, a primary target, but this is probably not something for researchers. It's more something for activists, for to build, to keep alternative role models alive, and to build examples, and to let them pass through the wall of social media. One other small comment on the issue. Should we go global in this endeavor that we are collectively trying to devise? Yes, sure, what has been said I fully share, but in the meantime, I think we shouldn't forget local and national specificities, particularly as far as how policy research relations are currently, or at least until yesterday, have been structured in our national contexts. Christina has done enlightening work on this, but also Peter Scholten has worked a lot on how in different national contexts research policy dialogues or non-dialogues take place. And so assuming that there is everywhere a situation like in the Netherlands where you get heard is misleading, and simply it cannot work elsewhere, not in many parts of Southern or Eastern Europe, maybe less so, even less so in sending regions or countries where independent research, independent media are very, very weak. So also this is a constraint. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Marley.
I'm Martin Shane from New York University. A small observation. The Gallup poll that's taken every year about immigration, what I call the Goldilocks poll, too many, too few, or just enough. The percentage of people who think there are too few immigrants in the United States has been increasing over the past 8 years, together with the percentage of people who think there are just enough immigrants in the United States, which has also been increasing slightly. At the same time, the percentage of people who think there are too many immigrants has been declining, and declining relatively rapidly since the election of Donald Trump. So that we shouldn't presume too much from the impact of public policy, or certainly not presume too much from the statements of public officials.
Thank you, Marley. François, tu veux...
Well, I'd like to make a comment about the use of numbers in all these controversies. Very often I was asked when I was heading the National Institute for Demographic Studies, well, Mr. Dear Director, could you tell us what is the optimal number of immigrants we should be able to welcome in France? And what is our absorptive capacity? And regularly you can see some MPs or senators who try to introduce into the law the idea that we should determine the exact number of migrants we should welcome next year according to our objective capacities from a demographic point of view, economic point of view, etc. Sometimes including the public opinion, the state of the public opinion, and things like that, and the quantity of housing, and so on and so on. So this idea is deeply rooted. It's a sort of it has to do with the anthropological basis you mentioned, the idea of the limited pie. I remember that in Naples in 19th century, there was the idea that when you wish a happy good new year to somebody, you have to wish a bad new year secretly to somebody else in order to compensate for, because it is a famous theory of the limited good, as Foster mentioned it in the 60s already, an idea which is deeply rooted. So the idea that, yes, we have a limited capacity, and science, and this is the trump, science could be a tool which we could use to determine objectively the size of these capacities, to determine whether they are already saturated or not, and to give a sort of objective basis for policy making for the MPs who would vote the number of migrants we should welcome next year. And I'm struck by the fact that in the 60s and 70s, in the demographic literature, yes, the idea of optimal population, optimal migration, optimal rates of was an important idea. Alfred Sauvy devoted a lot of energy to determine the optimal figures of all demographic components. This idea has been completely abandoned by the demographers. It still exists among the economists, or a fraction of the economists, the idea that there are some optimal figures. It would be, and now you have a sort of the rest of this idea is still obtaining among the political milieu. In fact, the welcoming capacity is completely a political and idea, political concept. You can, because it's just you have just to observe the proportion of immigrants across Europe. It varies a lot among countries, even more if you unbroaden the vision to the rest of the world. And so you cannot determine from the mere observation which percentage of immigrants should be optimal. But this idea is deeply rooted. And I'm struck by the fact that now, and to me, Stephen Smith's book about La ruée vers l'Europe, or Scramble for Europe. It's the English version of the book, Nach Europa in German, etc. It has been translated into several languages. The idea is, okay, we are not against African migration for cultural reasons, or for religious reasons, or for because of cultural distance or racial distance and so on. No. The reasons of our fear are objective. And the strong insistence we put now on the climate migration, for example, is also an example of this. Now we have to fear migration for objective reasons. And the scientists should be with us. There are, to some extent, there are demographic migrations, or there are climatic migrations driven by objective forces which are not any longer the results of political forces or cultural forces or things like that. And it's much more difficult to answer this kind of demonstration. It's quite difficult to refute this demonstration. So this makes our work rather difficult, I think. But and the problem is we have not only to look at the facts, for example, what is exactly the exact proportion proportionate to our population per capita of asylum seekers to whom we really gave a positive decision. If you make this calculation, which is never done, but if you make this calculation, you realize that France occupies the 16th rank, that the UK does even worse, that Germany, Austria, and Sweden, etc. You can take into account the gross national product, and you see that the classification is a little modified, but not really. So and what is very interesting in this case, all these figures have been ordered by the governments themselves. It is absolutely, all the governments have to give to Eurostat all the data by semester, by trimester, etc., to Eurostat. And so these figures are official figures, but the government don't use them. So one of our missions would be to use the statistical system, which is has made a lot of progress. If you look at what Eurostat publishes now, or OECD also, a lot of progress has been made, and you can use this as a lever against a state that have themselves order this kind of statistics. So I think it's something we could use. But of course, there are other problems completely different, which touch the question of interpretation, for example. I've demonstrated that Marine Le Pen, for example, 15 years after her father, had launched the idea that the European Union, since the 50s, had decided to send to Europe hundreds of millions of immigrants, and she gave a very precise figure, and that's why I was like, what is this? First of all, in the 50s, the European Union didn't exist yet. And then, so she made exactly 3 mistakes. First, it was not since the 50s, it was a prospect, a projection, demographic projection for 2050, okay, and not from 1950. Well, it's a mistake of time, une erreur de temps, okay. Then it was, she alluded to the prospect by United Nations for Europe, but she believed that it was a decision taken by Europe, and she confounded prospects and project. The scenarios of demographers had been converted in its mind already for his father 15 years sooner as a project. Instead of a scenario, it was the idea, yes, we have to send all these millions of immigrants in order to counter the aging process and so on. So this famous report on the replacement migration in 2000, published in 2001. Okay, so now if you examine all these errors, you can publish a book, you dedicate a whole chapter to this question, you make the demonstration, okay, but it doesn't suffice. It has absolutely no impact. And last week, Marine Le Pen delivered a press conference in which she exactly repeated the same, same errors, the same figures, and the same complotist idea of the European Union trying to, etc. What can we do with it? So we will never convince the Front National or Rassemblement National to change methods. It's very difficult to know whether they really lie or whether they believe in their lies. Or I renounce to deepen this question. But what we can do is trying to spread this kind of explanation to all the public, to the media, to the journalists. And yes, there is a possibility of gaining a field in all this intermediate area of people who hesitate. They don't know exactly what to think about this. They are semi-convinced, and there is a possibility of convincing this public. I'm sorry I've been a little long, but I wanted to give you a concrete idea of how we could work on this kind of issues.
Oui, bonjour, si vous permettez, je m'exprimerai en français. Je suis Alain Régnier, le délégué interministériel pour l'accueil et l'intégration des réfugiés auprès du gouvernement français. Je voudrais tout d'abord saluer cette initiative, parce que je pense effectivement que nous avons un vrai besoin de science, et peut-être déjà dans un premier point dire que l'époque dans laquelle nous sommes, c'est quand même une remise en cause, au-delà de ce sujet des migrations, d'une manière générale de la science et des recherches scientifiques, pour un monde de croyances plus que de recherche scientifique. Donc ce sujet, il intervient dans une période, encore une fois, très marquée par le recul de la science et de la difficulté de promouvoir la recherche scientifique. La deuxième chose, c'est aussi, ce qui est aussi marquant pour moi au cours des 20 dernières années, c'est la transformation de l'opinion publique qu'on retrouve dans l'ensemble des pays développés sur la notation des migrants, comme on va la retrouver sur les pauvres. Il y a les bons et les mauvais. Et donc il y a une représentation qui est construite aussi autour de ce qui serait un bon parcours de migrants ou un mauvais parcours de migrants. Et enfin, la polarisation aujourd'hui des sociétés développées fait que moi je m'interroge sur la cible, la manière dont on peut rester quand même optimiste pour l'avenir. Et donc, pour moi, la cible, elle est dans une démocratie, ce qui fait la politique, c'est pas les autorités politiques sont importantes, mais ce qui crée une autorité politique, c'est une majorité dans une démocratie. Donc, comment travailler sur l'opinion qui... c'est un poste récent, j'ai moins d'1 an d'expérience, mais j'ai déjà fait une trentaine de déplacements. Je vois très nettement que pour ce qui est de la société française, je pourrais qualifier comme ça, au doigt mouillé, à au moins 35%, si ce n'est pas 40% des Français qui sont des Français accueillants, ouverts sur la question de la migration et qui ont des inquiétudes, mais qui n'a pas besoin de convaincre, y compris par un travail scientifique particulier. Et vous avez de l'autre côté 30 à 35% des Français qui sont résolument convaincus que nous sommes face à un grand remplacement, à une menace de toutes sortes. Et ceux-là, ils seront totalement hermétiques à tout discours scientifique et à toute réflexion. Et au contraire, nous ne feront qu'accréditer leur point de vue que nous sommes des complotistes, nous sommes les élites et que nous les manipulons avec des chiffres qui sont faux. Donc la question pour moi, elle est sur la cible centrale de la population française qui fait basculer une élection ou qui fait basculer une élection dans les autres pays démocratiques. C'est donc les 20 à 30% qui, dans un scrutin, vont faire une majorité. Et je pense que pour ce qui est de la France, et encore une fois, d'après l'expérience qui est la mienne, il y a un terreau favorable à faire passer, encore une fois, de la recherche et de l'information éclairée à une partie centrale de la population qui est convaincue, à mon sens, qu'elle n'échappera pas au phénomène migratoire, que ça fait partie des données de ce siècle, mais il y a cette peur qui va parfois les faire basculer du côté qui, dans une élection, vont être du côté qui va faire basculer une majorité. Donc pour moi, la réflexion que je conduis là en tant qu'autorité publique, c'est de travailler avec vous sur quels outils, quels moyens de parler à cette population, je dirais, centrale, qui est inquiète, mais qui n'est pas opposée à l'argumentation scientifique et qui a besoin d'être mieux éclairée sur ces sujets dans une polarité, comme vous l'avez dit sur les réseaux sociaux, très manichéenne sur les migrations. Donc voilà, c'est simplement, encore une fois, bravo pour cette initiative et comment réfléchir ensemble à essayer de travailler sur cette cible des citoyens des pays développés qui ont un besoin de réflexion et avant de les convaincre.
Merci. Alors, a brief translation of what has been just said. So, le préfet Alain Régnier is in charge of putting together all the administrations which take in charge the welcoming and the refugees in France. It's a newly created interministerial delegation, and we used to work together sometimes, and we meet very regularly. And your idea that yes, there is a block of people of let's say 1/3 of the population which is completely hermetic to scientific explanation, and at the other side another block more or less equivalent of people who really cherish hospitality and are ready to welcome migrants. And in the middle, you have this vast gray area of people who are open to scientific argumentation, although they fear the development of migration phenomenon. So our work would be to try to convince this intermediate population, which will play a very important role in next elections.
I take 3 more questions, and then...
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Michael Neumann. I work with MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières. So a couple of things. First, I mean, the attempt to debunk myth and to address the idées reçues, preconceived notion in the public opinion, it's been going on on my side, personally, 12 years. And in this room, probably a bit 1,000 years if we addition all of your experience. With a little success, as we all share. It's not that we failed, but so far we haven't succeeded. And I think there's been a number of reasons that, a reason already in the room to explain that. I'm not that familiar with the international panel on climate change, but I can see that the journalists have actually embraced the cause, mostly. I'm not talking about like recent social media, fake news, and so on, but mostly mainstream media have embraced the cause for climate change. They're not embarrassed of showing graphs, scientific data, and not only a polar bear drowning in the iceberg. This has not happened yet on migration, and I'm wondering, and this is the question I had to ask after I have a comment, what is your perspective of engagement with journalists, as really, as it was said earlier, I mean, considering the discussion as an arena, to, I mean, the need of a medium, and the media is the medium per definition. And I'm thinking, for instance, of, you know, like you were mentioning, Monsieur Héron, the La Ruée vers l'Europe of Stephen Smith. And the first review that was published by Le Monde of La Ruée vers l'Europe by a well-known journalist, the one that is following migration in general for the newspaper, was very positive. Marilyn Baumard, whom I respect, and we all respect, and her work, I mean, made a brilliant appraisal of that book that we all know, I mean, fell short of noticing the shortcomings of the book and its deficiencies. So even if this like cohort of people that we all should be working with, I mean, we are not succeeding. And this is, you know, a question: how to convince these journalists who actually only ask to be convinced and to use them as a real efficient relay. And then one short comment. We've talked about facts, you know, a lot, about the failure of facts only to convince whether there are 30% or 40% or 60% of the public opinion. And I think this is true. It failed. Recently, I had a very interesting conversation with Benjamin Boudou, whom you know well because he works at the Max Planck Institute, who's a politist and a philosopher, who recently, and we invited him for a conference, and I think he initiated with us, I mean, in his work, but with us, a very interesting conversation on democracy and how to integrate migrations and migrants in the democracy, and to enlarge the debate beyond anthropology, sociology, facts, geography, but also to embrace the political dimension of democracy. And I think this is something that can work, not alone, again, not in isolation, but as we're seeing right now in France, we are living a particularly vivid democratic moment. There is certainly an appetite for democratic discussion, the place of the citizens, how decisions are being made. And I think this is one of those moments where actually, and again, I mean, I don't want to be the first one to mention the Gilets jaunes, where I can see that everybody really swear not to mention the Gilets jaunes in this room. But actually, despite slogans here and there, migration is not the core issue. Huh? I mean, this is not against migration that these people are being mobilized. It's more something of a call for democracy or representation. And I think there is no reason why migration could not be integrated in this discussion, and how actually migrants themselves, as people who suffer the consequences on migration policies, be integrated in the discussion. And I think this is what I really liked of, in Benjamin's work when I read it and listened to him. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I take two other questions, and then I will ask you to answer extremely briefly, so that we can have a coffee break and then continue the discussion, because we have also a proposal for you afterwards. So I would like you to stay and discuss with us in French.
Okay. Marie-Laure Basilien-Guinche, I am law professor at the University of Lyon. I just want to react to what Michael said, because I think that it was, during our discussions, often mentioned the question of fact-checking or alternative facts. And I think the initiative cannot be only reacting to such alternative facts. I spent the weekend explaining to journalists that what the Gilets jaunes were saying about the global compacts were totally not true, in fact false, and mistakes and phantasm. And well, it's difficult to deconstruct mythologies about migrations, and we have to propose something else. And a narrative, we talked this morning about building up a narrative, but I think we have to propose it to the journalist in the order that it will be available for them to grab the scientific dimension they need for their own papers and the newspapers to nourish their own thought about the subject. It was the point I had only.
Bonjour, Marie-Caroline Saglio, je suis professeure d'anthropologie à l'INALCO et fellow de l'ICM. My question is directly linked to what has been said. I think your proposal is coming in a very specific context where there is a kind of a divide also between, you've been talking about researchers seen as an elite also, and an opinion. There is, of course, there is a part of this opinion, part of this public understanding, which is leaving migration not as a problem, which is experimenting migration in a positive way also. But the problem is that we're not listening, we're not hearing this part. So I guess there is a whole way of having your proposal, and I think this is a big challenge, to work also with this opinion, to work with the media, to work also with, I would say, NGOs and associations, which seems to me one of the best interlocutor for this kind of work and debate, because I feel that the gap between research and opinion and population could be an obstacle for your proposal. And I think we need to find the good tools also to talk to everybody. On that point, I would say that coming back to Agamben and what he's saying about crisis of experience, I think we need to hear a lot about experience, experimenting, not only about knowledge.
Merci, Marie-Caroline. Est-ce qu'on conclut? Voilà. Final remarks before we have the coffee break, then we continue. So everybody will have a chance to speak in the next session. Our panelists want to say something.
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
No, you can go first.
Just briefly on the very important just one pie syndrome, which was mentioned by some of us. I think, or as Velatin said, mors tua vita mea. So the idea that our destinies are in a sort of communicating basis, and the benefit of one is the misfit of the negative impact of another. I think this is crucial for the public understanding. But in order to counter this, you have to convince people that you can multiply pies, and this is ultimately a task for politics. I'm not sure it can be, surrogated by scholars. Progressive politics was basically about that, the idea that the pie could be expanded through the exploitation of complementarities. And the exploitation of complementarities was basically what allowed solidarity, which is not charity, to expand as the glue of post-war societies. And I would also would like to mention one less known example in talking about the relations between Europe and Africa. I learned from a wonderful book by Swedish scholar P.O. Hansen called Eurafrica that in the post-war, also between the two wars, but in the post-war period, there was a very strong stream of thought emphasizing the complementarities between Europe and Africa as a factor of common growth. Of course, this was, bathed into a very imperialist and one-sided understanding. But that, I think, was striking, and I was completely amazed by reading that on the day after the signature, the reach of a political agreement for the Rome Treaty in February 1957, Le Monde titled Leur Afrique est née. Well, for France, that was clearly a way to socialize, to Europeanize the costs of those colonies, and then in the 10 years after, the problem simply disappeared with the independences. But that kind of understanding of intercontinental relations was certainly, even though in a source that is past, the kind of, grand thinking that I think is needed for addressing the kind of dramatic dilemmas, tragic dilemmas that are at the core of this book that I also happen to have read and which I found also quite disappointing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just to return to this point about what kind of debate do we need to have with sections of the public who are very anxious and possibly ground their beliefs in quite emotive instincts rather than facts, and how do we insert facts and evidence and so on. So, I mean, obviously one trend recently we've seen is the turn towards deliberative democracy. And I think there is some potential in these techniques around, citizens' assemblies and so on. So what they do is they offer a structured debate in which a number of people join together across a few days, take evidence, are presented with facts, are able to discuss and argue. And apparently this really does yield a change. Even on quite emotive issues, it's been seen to work, so that people coming out of those experiences often have adjusted their beliefs and their perceptions, but it's managed in a way. I think one of the concerns that politicians on the more progressive side have about opening up a debate on immigration is that it might unleash a number of quite inappropriate views that might not be compatible with values of liberal democracy or human rights. But I think in that more structured context, you can actually set out quite clearly what particular parameters are. You can present evidence. You can allow people to debate quite freely. So I think, I mean, it's not a panacea, but I think there is some potential in thinking along those terms.
I don't want to keep us here too long, but I do want to address this issue of media engagement. I think that is one of the crucial ones I've been thinking about. How can this new panel, if it comes off the ground, really engage the media? Because let's face it, the media is the first and foremost mode of conveying to a wider public, obviously. There's the issue of the 30% skeptics. I mean, in Germany, it's only 20%, so I can be thankful for something where I'm living. But don't know what to do about those. Will we ever reach those people? Well, again, it's a question of framing, though. That if we can change the frame a little bit, then maybe some of the ways of thinking might adjust, but not sure about that. It's this question of, understanding the media's predicament. A couple of months ago, I had a whole afternoon in Der Spiegel in Hamburg with editors there, and it was clear their conundrum. They wanted to kind of, their own feelings, they wanted a kind of pro-migration message, but they kept saying, but we have to show the problems. We have to show the problems. We have to empathize with the people who see migration as a real threat. But we don't want to give any ammunition to the AfD, to the far right. So they were really boxed in. And so I get that it's journalists' job to empathize or to convey the views of those who see migration as a real problem. But if that's all we're hearing all the time, and the focus is all on the far right all the time, that exacerbates and heightens the actual impact or weight that they have in society, obviously. And this one journalist kept saying, yeah, but as journalists, we have to talk about the one airplane that crashes, not the 1,000 that are in the air. And I kept saying, well, no, if the public thinks that all these planes are coming down, you've got to talk about the 1,000 that are still in the air. You've got to talk about those positive experiences, the absolute normalcy of diverse, migrant-driven populations in cities all across the country, that it's absolutely normal and acceptable for a lot of people, but we don't hear that because of this focus on we've got to show the problems, we've got to show the problems, we've got to show that we're doing the good journalistic thing. So I'll just end that one way that at our institute that we're trying to deal with things, although it's not going to be practicable for this panel, is we've initiated journalist in residence fellowships. We'll have 3 journalists a year come and live with us and see how we talk about and do things, not to convert them or anything like that, but just to expose them to other ways of thinking. So if there's any journalists in the audience, please apply.
Virginie, could I also...
One word. We're breaking. We have coffee break. We'll come back after that. But
yeah. Well, my institute is about labor and labor relations and also social inequality. And we haven't talked very much about social inequality yet. But of course, we all know that, let's say, what the populists, both on the right and the left side, are doing very good, at least from their perspective, is, let's say, framing migration as kind of a cause of social exclusion of, let's say, the lower classes in our society. I think so. One of the, if you really want to be successful also as an international panel on migration, I think we really have to hook up also with people like Piketty, who is working on social inequality, and also show, of course, that social inequality and the deepening of it is a very important factor, but of course it affects both natives and migrants. So that it's a wrong, let's say, kind of framing of what is happening, and that's also, let's say, the pie discussion that we had before. So I think we also have to engage more with what social inequality is and how it enters this debate in a way that we think as scholars is not the most productive.
Thank you. Thomas Piketty was one of the first signatories, actually the second after Jean Jouzel in June. He's very interested in what we're doing because he thinks that actually these two discussions they do link up for sure. Alors, we will now break for 15 minutes for coffee, but I invite you to pick up a copy of our declaration, which is on the table as you exit the room. And coffee is in room 8. Alors, le café sera servi en salle 8. Et donc, vous pouvez prendre notre déclaration. Il y a une pile sur la table en sortant. Et je voudrais remercier tous nos invités. Thank you very much.
In this room, all in French.
So it's going to be in French.
Yeah. I'll sit next to somebody who speaks French. Well, I don't know if I want to leave altogether. I'll do some email.